Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty incredible unfolding story. We're talking about how a network of small, rural farmers up in Maine basically decided they'd had enough of massive government bureaucracy, and they took a real stand to reclaim control over their own food. This is a true grassroots rebellion, one that fundamentally altered state law, shifting the power of food regulation completely away from distant bureaucrats and right back into the hands of local communities. It's just a fascinating look at the balance of power, community trust, and, the very basics of human nourishment. Okay, let's dive into this. It's a really provocative question, isn't it? Do you have a constitutional right to choose your food? I mean, most of us would intuitively say, well, yeah, of course. We walk into a grocery store and we just buy whatever we want. But legally speaking, who actually controls what you're allowed to buy and eat? For decades, state and federal agencies have heavily regulated the production, processing, and sale of food, primarily to protect public health. But as we're going to see today, a growing movement in Maine argues that these sweeping regulations actually prevent people from eating the healthy, locally produced food of their choosing. To really understand why this rebellion kicked off, we have to look at what these rules were originally built for. Just imagine massive, endless industrial crop fields right next to factory-scale food processing conveyors, pumping out perfectly standardized products. The vast majority of our modern state and federal food regulations, the third-party inspections, the licensing, the insanely expensive facility requirements, all of that was designed specifically to police this massive industrial food system. And honestly, in a globalized supply chain where your apple might travel thousands of miles before it finally reaches your plate, that kind of heavy regulatory oversight makes a lot of sense. But here is the massive disconnect. Think about this for a second. A staggering 63% of Maine's farmers have annual sales below $10,000, and 90% have sales below $100,000. So unlike the massive row crop operations of the Midwestern Corn Belt, Maine's agricultural industry is mostly made up of tiny, family-run farms, homesteaders, and backyard growers. When the state applies that exact same factory-scale red tape, like requiring expensive commercial kitchens or specialized pasteurization equipment, to a neighbor who's just selling a few jars of jam or a couple gallons of milk, it completely crushes these tiny businesses. It makes local, small-scale farming financially impossible. This whole regulatory burden hit an absolute boiling point in 2011 with a farmer named Dan Brown. Brown became the ultimate David versus Goliath test case. He was just a small-scale farmer who got taken to court by the state and ultimately fined over $1,000. His big crime? Selling raw milk from a single cow right at his farm without a state license. Now, the state argued they were simply enforcing basic public health standards. But for small farmers, this specific regulatory turf war proved that the state's rules were actively destroying their livelihoods. It felt like consumers are being stripped of their right to buy exactly what they wanted directly from the person who made it. Section 1. What is food sovereignty? A grassroots solution. You might think Dan Brown's defeat in the courts would have crushed the movement, but actually scratch that. It completely galvanized rural communities to seek a brand new framework. And they found it in a concept called food sovereignty. Officially, it's defined as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food, produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. In plain English, it means putting the people who produce, distribute, and consume the food at the absolute center of the food system. It's all about returning power to local communities, completely bypassing distant bureaucratic oversight and relying on direct, face-to-face trust. The core idea is, if you want to buy a homemade pie from your neighbor, you really shouldn't need the federal government's permission to do it. Section 2. Maine's Grassroots Rebellion. David versus Goliath. Let's move to and see how this builds over time, because it happens incredibly fast. Armed with this really powerful idea, the citizens of Maine decided to fight back. In 2011, towns like Sedgwick and Blue Hill began passing local food sovereignty ordinances. They were effectively declaring themselves exempt from state and federal food regulations for local transactions. Now, the state pushed back hard, which led to Dan Brown losing his Supreme Court case in 2014. But the grassroots pressure was just immense. By 2017, the Maine state legislature formally surrendered some of its power, passing the trailblazing Maine Food Sovereignty Act. And incredibly, in 2021, Maine voters went a step further, passing an amendment that enshrined the right to food directly into the Maine state constitution with a 60% majority. Section 3. Bypassing the bureaucracy. Trust over red tape. So with this massive legal victory, how does this actually work in practice? How do they protect public health while bypassing state health regulators? So the crucial point here is the direct producer-to-consumer transaction. Under the Maine Food Sovereignty Act, municipalities can adopt ordinances that exempt food sales from state licensure and inspection. But, and this is a big but, only if the transaction happens directly between the producer and the consumer. The idea is simple: neighbor trusting neighbor. If a consumer can look the farmer in the eye, ask about their farming practices, and mutually agree to a purchase, the law assumes the consumer is educated enough to accept any risks without needing a state inspector acting as a middleman. And this localized deregulation covers a really wide variety of foods. Under these ordinances, you can directly buy locally grown vegetables and fruits, home-baked goods and prepared meals, eggs, and raw milk and dairy. It's worth noting that meat and poultry are a bit trickier because of federal preemption laws regarding slaughter inspections, but there are some exemptions built in for small-scale poultry producers processing a limited number of birds. Essentially, if it's a traditional food weight produced on a small scale, it's very likely covered. This whole thing represents a total paradigm shift, removing completely away from the old industrial bureaucracy model, the one heavily reliant on third-party government inspections, huge licensing fees, and forced standardization. Instead, we're shifting to the food sovereignty model. That one relies on face-to-face transparency, mutual agreement between adults, and deep community trust. It literally shifts the burden of safety from a regulatory agency directly onto the relationship between the buyer and the seller. Section 4, Community Trust and Growth. The power of local. And this isn't just some abstract legal theory anymore. It has massive real-world impact. Early on, tracking lists showed 97 towns jumping on board to adopt these ordinances. Well, that number has quickly swelled to at least 113 Maine municipalities today. That is roughly 30% of all the towns in Maine. Interestingly, there is a clear rural-urban divide happening here. You aren't going to see these ordinances in Maine's biggest city, Portland, which has plenty of licensed grocery stores. But out in rural and remote areas where farm stands and home kitchens are the primary retail hubs, these ordinances are incredibly popular. To really bring this down to earth, let's look at some concrete success stories. Thanks to a recent expansion of the law that allows these direct sales to happen at community social events, whether that's a local gathering at West Casugo Hall down in North Yarmouth, or setting up a brand new marketplace, we're seeing some incredible innovations. Up in Aroostook County, residents launched the Stockholm Sovereign Market. It's actually Maine's very first food sovereign marketplace, and it features local farm stands with dairy, breads, and baked goods, all from unlicensed local vendors selling directly face-to-face to their community members. And this brilliantly illustrates the real heart of the movement. Jerry First, the founder of the Stockholm Sovereign Market, summed it up perfectly. He said, "We want to connect people with farmers and growers directly without a third party involved." He notes that people are actively seeking out more personal responsibility right now, and they want to know exactly how their food is grown. It's about relationship building every bit as much as it is about grocery shopping. Now, beyond the cultural benefits, the economic logic behind this is incredibly sound. Studies highlighted in our source data point to something called the local food multiplier. Basically, for every $1 spent on local food, it generates an additional 78 cents of economic activity that stays circulating within that exact community. By cutting out the regulatory red tape and allowing small producers to actually turn a profit, these ordinances are directly injecting vitality and financial resilience right into Maine's rural economies. Which brings us to a final thought for today. Maine has essentially provided a blueprint for the rest of the country. They've proven that when communities stand up and demand the right to bypass industrial red tape, they absolutely can successfully reclaim the right to feed themselves. So, as you think about your own local food system, the farmers in your area, and the regulations that currently bind them, could true food sovereignty be coming to your hometown next? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep asking the big questions about what's on your plate.